This video is going to quickly cover the immigration restrictions of the Gilded Age. Recalling that we had already talked about in the 1840s and 1850s during the second wave of immigration that there had been a large number of Catholics who had come, Irish Catholics, and there had been increased immigration from not only Ireland but also from Germany. And there was this fear that they would steal American jobs, this fear of competition. So we see the first rise in what's called Nativism, which is a favoring of the native-born Americans. In the 1850s, there was a group called the Know Nothing Party that was formed, and they supported anybody who was white, who was a native-born American, and Protestants for public office, opposing pretty much everyone else. And they were called the Know Nothings because when people would ask about their group, they'd say, "I don't know nothing." And on the right-hand side here, you see Native Americans beware of foreign influence. This is not referring to Native Americans in terms of Native American tribes that we know exist, but rather native-born Americans. So when you see something like this, you need to make sure you know what time period it's coming from. And on the left, we see a cartoon that's depicting both the Irish and the Germans who were very strong with the different liquors, trying to kind of steal the ballot box. And there was a fear that both of these groups would gain too much political power. From the 1850s to the 1880s, we have a rise in Chinese immigration, and there are about 300,000 that come for work. Many of them, in fact, most of them settle on the West Coast. Some of the things that they settle in include coming and working for gold. With the advent of the gold rush, they're going to settle in places like San Francisco and other places in California, and they're going to open businesses to cater to the people that are coming. And an advertisement in China even said that the streets are paved with gold, not literally, but that you can make so much money coming here. And one of the biggest industries for the Chinese was laundry related, and they spread out as far as Montana. I know I've seen some Chinese laundries there. But it led to racism and discrimination. And one of the interesting things about Chinese immigration is when you look at most of the reasons that people have discriminated against groups of people throughout American history, it has always been because they had some kind of negative quality about them. For example, they didn't like the Irish because they were Catholic. They saw that as a negative. They didn't like the Irish because they drank too much. They didn't like the Germans because they drank too much. In the case of the Chinese, they didn't like them because they worked too hard. They had too good a work ethic, and that made the Americans look lazy, and they didn't like that. And they feared that because they worked so hard, that they would take over American businesses. So the nativism is going to rise again in the 1880s, and there's going to be people that are going to pressure Congress to do something about this. And it's not only Asian immigration, but also Southern and Eastern Europe, because as I mentioned previously, they look and seem different because they don't speak the language. They're unskilled workers. Irish workers are going to make up a lot of, so one of the important things during this time period is the first transcontinental railroad is going to be created and linked. And this comes from an act that was done by Congress during the time period of the Civil War, which is called the Pacific Railway Act. And the Republicans had been in complete control because the southern states had been in rebellion against the United States. So the Pacific Railway Act will set up this that is going to give the railroad companies more land for every amount of tracks that they lay. So pretty much they're getting constant land through this. So the Chinese are going to be hired to do the western portion, which you see here in red, and the Irish workers will be hired to do what you see in blue. Well, there's eventually going to become some skirmishes and conflicts between those groups. And where you see the little blue dot at the very middle of the screen where the red and blue meet, that is Promontory Point in Utah, and that is where the final stake was laid. And it was a golden stake that was laid in 1869 that connected west to east. It was the first transcontinental railroad. So Chinese immigrants had, again, been working. You see a little bit here about the discrimination that they faced. Hinton Helper, who we have read about before with the issue of slavery and him thinking that slavery hurts poor whites more than it hurts anybody else. He also is going to be someone who doesn't want to associate with blacks, so he's going to move from North Carolina and then come to find that China has an awful lot of Asian immigrants as well. And so you can see here his racist kind of comments and views. in terms of the copper of the Pacific as well as the ebony of the Atlantic. And then between 1850 and 1882, the Chinese population soars from just about 7,500 to 300,000. And Chinese will comprise 8.6% of California's total population and 25% of its wage earners. So many people in the United States, particularly in California, feel threatened, again, economically, that their jobs will be taken away. By 1870, 26% of California's Chinese population lives in San Francisco because San Francisco was the gateway. People had begun settling there earlier. It had been a gateway for the gold rush, particularly as people came, and then they would spread out and go up to Sacramento and Sutter's Mill and the different areas where they were finding gold. But many of them just settled there, and they started creating jobs, like I said, the laundry, but also other industries such as boot and shoemaking, woolen cloth, cigars, and tobacco manufacturing, sewing. By 1880, the Chinese will comprise a large percentage of the workers in these four key industries. So what they're going to do is Congress is going to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act, and this is a really important one for you to know. In the year 1882, it made it unlawful for any Chinese laborer to enter the United States. But it also declared that any Chinese person who was already living in the United States would be ineligible for U.S. citizenship. Now, citizenship laws at the time, if you were born in America, you were automatically a citizen, but there were naturalization laws that meant how long you had to stay in the United States, and then you could apply for citizenship. Well, this pretty much says it doesn't matter how long you've lived here, even if you've lived here almost your entire life, you are not eligible to become a U.S. citizen. This was supposed to last only for 10 years, but it was renewed in 1892 for another 10 years. It was made permanent in 1902, and as you can see, it's not until World War II that it is revoked, and it is opened up in 1943. So again, it's really important that you know the Chinese Exclusion Act forbidding all Chinese workers from entering the United States. In addition, we're going to have restrictions against the Japanese. In 1907, the Gentleman's Agreement was passed in an effort to calm tensions between Californians and Americans in general and Japanese immigrants. In 1894, there had been a treaty that had assured free immigration, but as increased numbers of Japanese came to California, they were met with hostility. In order to deal with this, in 1900, in August, Japan agreed to deny passports to workers seeking to enter the United States. However, this did not stop many workers who obtained passports to Canada, Mexico, or Hawaii. Hawaii was a territory at this point, but not a U.S. state, who then would move on to the United States. Racial antagonism intensified, and in May 7th of 1905, a Japanese and Korean Exclusion League was organized. And on October 11th, 1906, the San Francisco School Board arranged for all Asian children to be placed in a segregated school. Japan was prepared to limit immigration to the United States, but they were extremely hurt by the San Francisco's discriminatory law aimed specifically at its people. President Roosevelt wanted to retain good relations with Japan as a counter to Russian expansion in the Far East. So he intervenes, and they're going to make this agreement that Japan will agree to deny passports to workers entering the United States and will recognize the U.S. right to exclude Japanese immigrants holding passports originally issued to other countries. In exchange, the San Francisco School Board will withdraw its segregation order. So that's why it's called a gentleman's agreement, because it wasn't a law that was passed. What it was is that Japan agreed, we won't allow anyone to come to the United States either directly or through any of these other countries or areas that they were coming through, but in exchange they wanted their students that were already in the United States to be able to go to regular schools along with everyone else and not be segregated with that. Following that, in 1913, the Alien Land Act was passed. Again, this is California here. Asians in California couldn't own agricultural land. And part of the reason for this is, again, they were hard workers and they were growing crops, and many of the farmers and different workers felt that they were taking away their economic opportunity, and they were extremely upset about this. So the Alien Land Act sought to try to stop this concern of the farmers and American citizens. Immigration will decline significantly after 1914, following World War I or during World War I. And in the 1920s, there will be two acts that will be passed that will pretty much almost end immigration for a while. So this wave of immigration is from about the 1870s until 1920, as I mentioned. In 1921, which is not listed up here, they passed the Emergency Quota Act, which will limit the number of entrants to 3%, and it's based on the current census. So that means how many ever are in the country at the time, then only 3% of them. So let's just say there's 100 people of a certain origin, certain country in the United States, then only 3 more will be allowed per year. Well, now Congress is going to pass in 1924 an even more restrictive one. The National Origins Act is usually the way that I see it written, so I would know it that way, but it's also called the Immigration Restriction Act. And this will limit the number of entrants to 2%, but it would go all the way back to the 1890 census before many of these individuals from Southern and Eastern Europe particularly would be here. So this is really seeking to limit immigration from people that are the new immigrants that are from Southern, Eastern Europe, and Asia. And by moving it all the way back to 1890, before many of them came, it really restricts them. And that is it for the PowerPoint on immigration. Thank you.